Some people think power means you get to push others around. Mark Dalton believed that with his whole chest. And the morning he kicked a quiet woman in a courthouse hallway, he thought it was just another moment where he got to remind someone who was in charge. Yeah, that happened. What he didn't know was that the woman he kicked would end up being the one person in the city who could dismantle his entire world. And the way it all unfolded, well, it's the kind of story that makes you wonder how many bullies walk around thinking they're untouchable until the wrong day finally arrives. See, Brookdale wasn't a big city, but it had the same problems you see everywhere. Tension between the police and the people they're supposed to protect, rumors about corruption, and that quiet feeling in the air like something wasn't quite right inside the department. Mark Dalton had been a cop there for 15 years. Big guy, loud voice, the kind of man who walked into every room like it already belonged to him. Around the station, some officers called him old school, which is usually code for someone who thinks the badge is a license to act however he wants. Out on the streets, people had other names for him. None of them were flattering. Dalton didn't care. In his mind, the job was simple. You show people who's in charge, you keep them a little scared, and everything works fine. Fear equals respect. At least that's what he believed. That Tuesday morning, he had just finished testifying in a courthouse case, some small possession charge that barely mattered. The judge didn't question him. The prosecutor nodded along, and Dalton walked out, feeling like he'd just scored another easy win. The courthouse hallway outside the courtroom was crowded like always, families sitting on benches, public defenders carrying stacks of files, people whispering nervously about their cases. Dalton hated crowds because crowds slowed him down, and he didn't believe he should ever have to slow down for anyone. That's when he saw her sitting on the bench. A black woman, probably mid-40s, dressed neatly in a beige coat with a folder full of papers resting on her lap. She looked calm, focused, reading through documents like the noise around her didn't exist. Her feet were tucked in close to the bench, not blocking anyone, not bothering anybody. But she was sitting right in the path Dalton had decided to walk through. So he barked at her. "Hey, move," just like that. No hello, no excuse me, nothing. The woman looked up slowly, calm as a lake on a quiet morning. "Excuse me," she said. Dalton stopped in front of her and leaned down slightly. "I said move. This is a walkway." She glanced at the floor and then back at him. "There's plenty of room for you to walk around." Now that might sound like a small thing, but for a man like Dalton, that was basically a challenge. People nearby started glancing over. He didn't like that. His ego needed the moment to go his way. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he muttered. The woman closed her folder carefully and said, "My name is Maya Reynolds and I'm not breaking any rules." Something in Dalton's head snapped. Without warning, he stepped forward and kicked her shin with the steel toe of his boot, hard. The impact knocked her folder off her lap and papers scattered across the hallway floor. Someone gasped. Another person froze mid-step. Dalton just laughed. "Well, look at that," he sneered. "Now you've got a reason to be on the floor." The woman didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't make a scene. She simply bent down and began collecting the pages calmly. After a moment, she looked up at him and said quietly, "Your name and badge number." Dalton tapped the badge on his chest like he was proud of it. "Officer Mark Dalton, badge 7421. Go ahead and file a complaint." Then he stepped over the papers and walked away laughing. In his mind, that was the end of it. Just another morning where he reminded someone who held the power. What he didn't know was that a few hours later, the entire police department had a mandatory meeting. Rumors had been floating around that the mayor was bringing in a new police chief from out of town to clean things up after a scandal forced the last chief to retire early. Dalton didn't care about that either. He sat in the second row sipping coffee, joking with younger officers. "Watch," he said. "Another suit who thinks they know policing better than we do." The mayor stepped up to the podium and started talking about reform and rebuilding trust. Dalton barely listened. Then the mayor turned toward the side doors and said, "It's my honor to introduce the new chief of police for the city of Brookdale, Dr. Maya Reynolds." The doors opened, and Dalton felt the blood drain from his face, because the woman walking toward the podium was the same woman he had kicked that morning in the courthouse hallway. Same eyes, same calm expression, except now she wore a perfectly pressed police uniform with 4 silver stars on her collar. The room stood and applauded. Dalton stood too, but his body felt like stone. Chief Reynolds reached the microphone and slowly scanned the crowd. When her eyes found Dalton, she held the look for 3 long seconds. She didn't smile, didn't glare, just stared. Then she said calmly, "As of today, everything about how this department operates is going to change." Dalton felt sweat forming on the back of his neck. After the meeting, he rushed upstairs to find the one man he believed could save him, Captain Greg Harlow from Internal Affairs. Harlow had built a reputation over the years as someone who knew how to make problems disappear. Dalton burst into the office and blurted out, "Did you see the new chief?" Harlow nodded casually. Dalton leaned closer. "I met her this morning." Harlow frowned. "What do you mean?" Dalton swallowed hard. "I kicked her." The room went silent. Harlow rubbed his forehead slowly. "You kicked the new police chief." Dalton nodded nervously. "I didn't know who she was." Harlow started pacing the room. "Listen, keep your head down. If she files anything, it comes through me first." Dalton nodded, clinging to that hope. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. No disciplinary meeting, no suspension, no complaint. Dalton started to believe he'd gotten away with it. You know how people are. If consequences don't come immediately, they start convincing themselves they never will. One evening, Dalton and a rookie officer named Briggs drove to a small auto shop owned by a mechanic named Luis Alvarez. Dalton had been shaking Luis down for years, demanding small envelopes of cash in exchange for leaving the business alone. As they pulled into the lot, Dalton told the rookie, "Turn off your body cam." Briggs hesitated. "Policy says we can't." Dalton glared at him. "Turn it off." The rookie obeyed. Dalton walked into the garage where Luis was wiping grease from his hands. "Evening," Luis Dalton said casually. Luis looked tired. "Officer Dalton." Dalton circled the shop slowly. "Nice business you've got. Shame if an inspector shut it down." Luis shook his head. "I don't have the money today." Dalton grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against a truck. "You pay the tax, or I shut you down." What Dalton didn't know was that hidden cameras were watching everything. Detective Carla Ortiz sat in a surveillance van nearby with an FBI technician. Every threat, every shove, every word recorded. Ortiz picked up the radio. "Chief, we got him." The next morning, Dalton walked into the station feeling confident again. At exactly 8 o'clock, the intercom announced that Dalton Captain Harlow and Officer Briggs needed to report to an interrogation room immediately. When they walked inside, they found Chief Reynolds standing there with Detective Ortiz and a man in a suit. "This is Special Agent Daniel Mercer with the FBI Public Corruption Task Force," Reynolds said calmly. Ortiz pressed a button and a screen lit up showing footage from Luis Alvarez's garage. Dalton watched himself threaten the mechanic, every word clear as day. Dalton stammered, "That's illegal surveillance." Agent Mercer dropped a document on the table. "Federal wiretap warrant." Harlow's face went pale. Chief Reynolds stepped closer to Dalton and said quietly, 2 weeks ago, you kicked me in a courthouse hallway. If I had fired you that day, your friends would have buried the case, so I waited." The rookie officer Briggs broke down crying and immediately started cooperating with the FBI. Agent Mercer turned to Harlow and revealed financial records linking him to the extortion scheme. Within minutes, federal agents were putting handcuffs on the captain. Dalton stood frozen, realizing he had no one left to protect him. Chief Reynolds looked directly at him and said, "Officer Dalton, surrender your badge and weapon." His hands shook as he placed them on the table. Detective Ortiz cuffed him and led him out of the room. 8 months later, Dalton stood in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit. Witness after witness testified against him, including the rookie and even Captain Harlow. The judge finally leaned forward and said, "You were given authority to protect the public and you used it to terrorize them." Then he sentenced Dalton to 12 years in federal prison and stripped him of his pension. Months later, Chief Reynolds walked through that same courthouse hallway where Dalton had kicked her. A young officer approached a man whose foot stuck slightly into the walkway. Instead of shouting, the officer simply smiled and said, "Excuse me, sir." Then he walked around him. Chief Reynolds watched quietly and allowed herself a small smile. The department still had work to do, but the culture was changing. Now, I want to ask you something. Do you think 12 years was justice, or was it too much? And have you ever seen someone abuse power like this in real life? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this raise a bigger question about authority, accountability, and whether people in power